Oi, Tony Vicha. What's up, Fight fans? It's your boy Jack Slack, Fights Gone By podcast, episode 114, The Death of Fedor Emelianenko. No, not really, because everyone who actually knew what they were talking about realised that it's 2019 and Fedor's been washed up for 10 years now. If you actually watched Fedor's career, you realised, even by the time he's fighting Tim Sylvia, that he's just going out there and swanging and banging. You know, he's not doing the smart things that got him to the dance and made him such a successful fighter. We were ranking him as like one of the greatest fight IQs of all time when he jumped into Nogueira's guard and grip stripped and pounded him, or when he went after Krokop, kept him on the back foot, dug to the body, and then only went to the trips in the later half of the round when he was tired. There was a huge difference between that dude and the dude who fought Tim Sylvia and just decided to swang and bang, or Andrei Arlovski and looked really, really slow and decided to swang and bang. But people refused to believe that he was done until he was getting knocked out by Dan Henderson. And then even after that, he fought some schlubs. Pedro Hizzo and Jeff Monson being the generation even before Fedor, as heavyweights go. Satoshi Ishii, who was just never good. And then get boxed up by Fabio Maldonado, stopped by Matt Mitrione, beat two old men in the worst tournament of all time, and suddenly you're back in the game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll slag off the Bellator tournament later. We got some news to get into. We'll talk about the good stuff from Fedor's career, because I think this might be, well, I hope this might be the end in terms of Fedor fighting again, so we can actually look back at all the amazing things that he did. But anyway, we'll do news first. What's going on? What's fun? What's good? What's really good? Rustam Khabilov has a fight booked against Carlos Diego for UFC Prague. That UFC Prague card started out because obviously European card, so the UFC don't really care. They packed off Jean Vellante to that card. But then this week it came out that Rustam Khabilov's on the card. And also Magomed Ankalaev, can't remember how to say his name. You know you're going to get your name pronounced wrong if you come to the Fights Gone By podcast, but he's fighting Klidson Abreu on the Prague card, and if you remember Ankalaev, or Magomed as we'll call him, he absolutely beasted Paul Craig for about 2 rounds and 4 minutes and 55 seconds maybe, and then he got caught with an incredible last second triangle and had tapped out immediately. And had he left it until he was sort of unconscious, he'd probably have gotten away with the win. But yeah, so that's pretty fun. That's going on. What else has been announced? Oh, in terms of flyweight stuff, this was announced before the just after the TJ fight. Quietly, the Jussier Formiga Davison Figueiredo flyweight fight added to UFC Nashville. That's in March, and it is going on at flyweight. I thought they might just put him in at bantamweight and sit on the fence regarding the future of the flyweight division, but that's pretty good because Jussier Formiga is rightly the number one contender. After that amazing fight with Sergio Pettis, which I think I've moaned about in every episode since then, so I won't bother continuing about that. And Davison Figueiredo is the flyweight that the UFC wish all the flyweights were, because he actually stops people. So that'll be a good fun fight. It could be that Davison Figueiredo smokes him. Could be that Jussier Formiga takes him down or gets on his back and Figueiredo can't do anything. I seem to remember Figueiredo looking pretty vulnerable in his last fight before he smoked the guy. Was that Moraga? I can't remember. What else is going on? The UFC also announced Ramiro versus Costa is back on for UFC Miami, April 27th. That one going on all night on the beach till the early morn. That's a good fight. We all know that's a good fight, but we also all know that they're both juiced to the tits. Allegedly. Well, if you've got eyes, you can pretty much assume. Just a couple of juicy boys in their banana hammocks going to be banging. And then on the same night as that card, April 27th, Bellator's just announced that they're going to be doing Rory versus John Fitch, which is a title fight but in the tournament, which sort of doesn't make sense because it means that anyone who fights Rory McDonald in the tournament has to fight 5 rounds, while almost every other fight in the tournament will be 3 rounds because Bellator's still doing 3-round main events. Strange, but that's Bellator, par for the course. I'm just happy that this tournament's actually moving along now because it's a banger. And that opens the right-hand bracket opened with Ruth versus Gracie the other month? Can't remember. But yeah, so I think that's the last. Is that the last of them going off on the first 4 fights, the quarterfinals? Because I think Daly versus MVP is happening in a couple of weeks, isn't it? Or maybe next week, I can't remember. But it's in Connecticut, so I don't have to give a shit because Bellator betrayed us. They're the reverse Benedict Arnold. What else going on? Oh yeah, on that same April 27th card, they booked Ilima McFarlane for a defense, so that's, packing out the card with 2 championship fights there. But you're still going head-to-head with 2 much better fighters in the prime of their careers, or at least combat sports careers. Ramiro, we consider him in his prime, because he's not dropped off yet. He's still amazing. And then news from outside the UFC Bellator bubble. I'm including them together, so Scott Coker's won there, sort of. But One Championship have announced the brackets for their lightweight tournament. I assumed this would be like a coronation, but my boy Grabaka Hitman, who watches pretty much every fight that ever happens, says that some of these guys are legit. There's some Russian names in there, so I was like, oh, okay, they might be legit. It's not just random Filipinos. However, the Filipinos have been doing very well in one, and having watched a couple of them, they are really good. They've got this crazy sort of like kick the wrestler as hard as you can and then try and get back up once they immediately take you down game plan. So I'll have a look through that, and I'll cover it like a proper tournament, because it looks like a proper tournament. Or at least people whose opinion I respect tell me it's a proper tournament. What else is going on? I have also announced a partnership with Shuto, the Japanese MMA promotion, sort of the B-tier promotion, but it's been around. It's one of the oldest, and they have their own weird weight classes where the weights are just generally much lighter. Every top Japanese prospect, or almost all of them, has come through Shuto at some point. Kyoji Horiguchi, was he a champion, or did he just win the Shuto rookie tournament? I can't remember. But he had a good run in Shuto. Takanori Gomi, Kid Yamamoto, Kaoluno, pretty much anyone. Kawajiri. I think Hioki too. Yeah, it's just sort of like a feeder league to bigger things, and one have sort of formalised that arrangement so that Shuto champions go straight into one. Because the worst thing that can happen is you get stuck being a Shuto champion forever and making no money. So I like that. That's a good move on one's part, picking up Asian talent in Asia immediately and having that locked in. But the comments on Reddit were like, checkmate, where are the one haters now? And you're like, this doesn't help their money situation at all. But anyway, that'll be fun. Plus, Shuto is sort of a uniquely boring place anyway. I liked Shuto for quite a while. They do have a weird, I think they ditched the 10-second, there's 10 count for knockdowns, but for a long time it was called like the home with the draw. If the fight goes to decision, it's a draw. What else happened? Oh, drug test news. Walt Harris suspended by the California State Athletic Commission for a positive drug test at UFC 232, setting a nice double standard there, the California State Athletic Commission. The drug tests matter when we say they matter. Walt Harris, if you remember him, he kicked Mark Godbeer in the head. I always confuse him with Justin Wilnis, whoever it was, the other short, tubby black heavyweight who just fought Mark Hunt. But no, he's not him. And then, outside MMA news, bare-knuckle boxing news. Norman Park has decided he's unretiring from MMA to take a bare-knuckle boxing match. Same week, the owner of the WBKFF, which was the one that had Bas Rutten involved, and I think they had that Johnny Hendricks fight where he lost to Dakota Cochran, which is just like the peak sad Johnny Hendricks meme. But, yeah, they have not paid any of their fighters, so their owner is being forced to pay $2.5 million in restitution, but is already convicted of mortgage fraud in Illinois, and is set to serve 3 years in prison and followed by 3 years of supervised probation, apparently. So I was looking at this guy. If you've been looking at this going, oh, bare-knuckle boxing is the easiest thing in the world to get into promoting because there's so many bad MMA fighters who think they could be great at bare-knuckle boxing and have some name value. Apparently it's not as easy as all that. Oh, and then Satoshi Ishii is going to one, but that's not particularly interesting. Oh, and Alejandro Perez, who's been around in the UFC forever, but has really done well. I think he's only got one loss in the UFC, is fighting Song Yadong, so stern test for both of those lads. Oh, and I forgot to mention it last week, but Ronda Rousey is now the voice of Sonya Blade in the new Mortal Kombat game, which I only really appreciate because I can go, "Do you miss me, baby? I studied all your moves." Such a bad film. But a classic, but bad, but also a classic. So that's the news out of the way. Shall we get into being depressed about The Last Emperor? So it's a quiet weekend, or it was a quiet weekend, and your boy Jack's waiting for the fights, so he tunes into Bellator 214, the big thing going on this weekend. Did he watch all of the prelims? Did he bollock? So I'm not going to watch 18 different fights by dudes I've never heard of. But I did watch the main broadcast. So, beginning at Adel Al-Tamimi versus Brandon Mcmahon, And the broadcast was terrible, as always. Mike Goldberg just fucking going on, and Big John going on and agreeing with him, and no one ever talking about the actual fights. They were using in the hype footage clips of Mauro going "Mamma Mia" and actually being excited and fun. And then they got to the card, and they were just like, no mention of Mauro. Here's Big John, and be grateful for him. I know I go on about this every time, but it's so bad. At least, when we're talking about the UFC, I get to talk about different commentators every time. This one, I just talk about the same shit over and over again. And they had the chance to bring Jimmy Smith back in, but Jimmy Smith's now doing Sirius XM or something like that. But, I mean, they could still bring him back in. They probably won't because they're idiots, but, Anyway, moving on. Adel, Al-Tamimi. You got the sense from this one, because they did a huge video package on one of the participants and didn't do anything about the other guy. He didn't even mention him, and they were busy doing... First off, Bellator is in like a cringeworthy just after 9/11 sort of era of entertainment, where everyone is having to hug a troop the entire time and thank them for their service. So just constant bollocks about the Marines. They had Marines come out into the middle of the cage. They did the national anthem before the main event, which is just fucking cringeworthy. And I can say all this because I'm British. Like, I've said this before, and people have been like, "You're not very patriotic, are you?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not American, right?" But yeah, just absolutely bizarre. Al-Tamimi seemed like a good guy. His story was really interesting. It was just so obvious that they wanted him to win this one because they didn't do anything about the other guy. And the other guy was on a losing streak or something. I think he lost his last two before this. And Al-Tamimi, I think, has only lost one. But anyway, it was actually a pretty fun fight. Al-Tamimi did well on the feet, and then Mcmahon went for a takedown. And Al-Tamimi went for the switch, changed to a Kimura, dropped into half guard, I think with the knee shield, and then pushed away. The guy kept his hand to his belly, which is like, what you do to stop the guy wrenching it up your back. Because it's a really strong position, the Kimura from half guard, or it isn't, depending on where the hand is. The Kimura from half guard, lots of guys think that it just doesn't work anymore and sort of ditched it. But if you go back and watch, the one I always use is Gary Tonin versus Buchecha. Gary Tonin is like 5'4", and I think he's fighting at like featherweight now in one, or maybe lightweight. Buchecha is 250 pounds ripped, and is one of the best heavyweights in the world, or I think at the time was the best heavyweight in the world. And Gary Tonin came in at short notice, like he was in the stands, and they said, "Can anyone replace whoever was injured?" And Gary Tonin stripped off, ran down to the mats, and took part. I think he'd already had that amazing match with Chrome Gracie just before this, but Tonin's a bit unknown at the time, and he has Buchecha in his knee shield half guard. Buchecha lets his hand out to do something, and Tonin just grabs it and wrenches it up his back, turns Buchecha over, so uses a Kimura to sweep a guy who's, almost got 100 pounds on him, practically. So it's a solid move if you catch the arm out, but the way to keep it in is to grip inside the thigh or to slam it to your belly and make sure that there's a barrier between the hand and where the opponent wants to put it. However, Al-Tamimi did a great job of using the hands pushed into the belly to sweep him over, and then changed to an armbar and won that way. It was really cool. Very nice little sequence, and both of them looked pretty good. There were a couple of guys actually on this card. Maybe it's because I didn't watch the prelims, because whenever I watch Bellator prelims, I'm very aware I'm watching Bellator prelims, but the standard of some of the guys on this card was actually pretty good. Is it Juan? Yeah, it's got to be Juan. He's American, so this is what you have. I think the Heavy Hands boys have talked about it before. In MMA, you either say Jose because you know that the Portuguese say it Jose and you try and look cultured, or you come off as a dickhead because you're saying Jose when the guy's actually got a Spanish name and it's Jose. But I think Juan is always Juan. So Juan Archuleta versus Ricky Bandejas. Ricky Bandejas coming off that knockout of James Gallagher, which was absolutely incredible. Knocks him down with the right hand early going, after looking a little bit timid, and then gives him the sweet chin music right in the face. And he was on a streak of wins going back to 2015 when he lost to Nick Pace, who's pretty decent, by guillotine choke. And Juan Archuleta was also on a long streak of wins. So a pretty good matchup, I thought. I think it's Archuleta trains with TJ Dillashaw, because Dillashaw was in his corner in some very ripped jeans. But then a lot of these fighters, when they do like corner work and appear in other organisations, they're wearing their sponsor, so it's normally like an Affliction t-shirt. It just looks dreadful. They skulls all over it. But yeah, you could see the influence of Dillashaw and Ludwig in Archuleta. Lots of stance switching combinations into takedowns. Tried a lot of different takedowns. He was reaching for snatch singles, high crotches, blast doubles, and he was just going between them, and it worked quite nicely. And it worked quite well too, because if you can change the sort of takedown you're attempting, provided you're not always diving straight in the same way, you can make it a little bit harder for guys like Bandejas who are looking for the knee the whole time. That's Habib 101. Feint with the head like you're going to do the takedown, then throw your head way to the outside of the opponent's lead leg and do the takedown on that side. Archuleta was good fun. Lots of stance changes and things. Did leave himself quite extended a lot of the time. He'd step in with a stance change and swing a long lead hook with what was now the lead side, and you're looking at it and going, oh, that's you're giving them a lot of room. But Bandejas was pretty cautious for most of the fight, I'd say. There was a long period in the second round where he was sort of walking Archuleta down, trying to score a knee as Archuleta stepped in for a takedown attempt, and he was sort of letting Archuleta get away with a lot of loose attacks without really countering him, because he was waiting for this level change. And can I just say, I always complain about Mike Goldberg and Big John, and then some nerd always goes, it doesn't matter, Mike John gets me hype, unlike John Anik. And if you watch this fight, tell me Mike Goldberg gets you hype. Mike Goldberg gets you hype after the fight's ended, because he goes, and it's all over. Joe Rogan was the part that was going, oh, when a guy got hit, or oh, he just head kicked him or whatever. Bandejas, I think it was Bandejas, kicked Archuleta in the head in the middle of Big John and Goldie going back and forth about tough New Jersey guys. He's going, and I'm talking about tough New Jersey guys, and Ricky Bandejas is talking about tough New Jersey guys, and I say, well, we say the same thing about you, and they both have like a laugh, and they go back to talking about tough New Jersey guys, and in the meantime, one dude's been kicked in the head and is backing off because he's clearly been a little bit caught by it, even if it hit him in the arm or whatever. Fucking astonishing. These guys will not talk about what's going on in the ring at all. And when you say it like that, it sounds like, why would you need someone to tell you what's going on in the ring? But that is what every commentator does in every sport. These dudes are just like a director's commentary where they tell you interesting factoids about the guys who are currently in the ring. And most of the time, they're not at all interesting. And his brother is a firefighter. And you're like, I don't give a shit. But anyway, yeah, it was a good fight, Archuleta versus Ricky Bandejas. I was sort of half paying attention to a lot of it because Goldberg really does send me to sleep with Big John. Goldberg and Big John send me to sleep. I would sleep with Big John to get Goldie out of the booth. But yeah, I felt like I remembered Bandejas being more effective, but they gave the fight to Archuleta. But I do remember, him having enough success that I wasn't at all bothered. I just thought, oh, that was pretty good, especially for a Bellator fight. Then we get into like the meat and potatoes of the main card, and a lot of these weren't great. Jake Hager versus Jw Kaiser. Kaiser was brought in to lose. He had people kept touting his amateur record or something like that, but if you're putting a really good wrestler in there with someone who's not particularly good, the wrestler should win. That's the way it works. Hager looked completely out of sorts on the feet, but I was looking at him going, God, what you could do with that build if he hadn't wasted half his life in the WWE. Well, I suppose he made a lot of money, but so he didn't waste his life at all. But what you could do with that build, because he looks kind of Gustafsson-esque but bigger, and it just really struck home to me. Wrestling is a weird one because you think the level change that favors sort of the shorter man a lot of the time, or the guy who can get lower. But there's also been these really lanky ass dudes like Hager and John Jones who've done very well wrestling. So it is it's one of those sports where you learn to work to your build. Effortlessly takes this dude down, gets on top of him, starts working for a Kimura from half guard, gives him a good elbow, moves to mount, and then gets the arm triangle. Standard procedure, really. And did the We the People thing. And I thought that was his heel gimmick, a xenophobic thing, because they gave him, what's his name, Dirty Dutch Mantel, as... can't remember what his character's name was, but... they kept it, and they did it for all the Titantron stuff too, and then at the end, he put his hand on his heart and screamed, "We the People," and it was really cringy. Who knows? Who knows? I didn't watch any wrestling during that time. I really only got back into it. I think the WWE owes a lot to internet lists and people being interested in like the old days of wrestling that they remember, and then getting back into wrestling that way. Then you had the co-main event, which was Aaron Pico versus Henry Corrales. If you have not watched the section of Joe Rogan's Fight Companion podcast for this, it's absolutely amazing because Brendan Schaub will not shut up about how amazing Aaron Pico is. And Eddie Bravo is trying to tell an interesting story about training Aaron Pico. Aaron Pico sought him out for coaching, and Brendan Schaub just can't shut the fuck up. He's like, he's our LeBron James. Just between every sentence, if Eddie Bravo stops for breath, he'll go, yeah, great guy. Our LeBron James. Knocked down Miguel Cotto in sparring the other week. Just like, shut up, Brendan Schaub. And then watching him lose, and Brendan Schaub just sort of like eating a dick on live podcast was great fun. I like Aaron Pico a lot. He's good fun, and his striking is so much better than it should be for a guy who is known as a wrestler, but then he doesn't really wrestle in MMA. He just doesn't always fight that smart. Like, he hurt this guy with, I think it was a counter left hook into an uppercut, and then he grabbed a hold of the back of his head and started just uppercutting over and over again like he was DC or a bus driver. And Corrales hit him, and then Pico was holding him with a right collar tie and dropping his left hand, and he dropped his left hand and then took a right overhand because his left hand just sort of stayed down there for no reason, and then got hit with another right uppercut and fell on his back stiff. But I think it was the one before that hurt him. Just like, if you both have a collar tie and you're both swinging, that's Don Fry versus Takayama. That's the epitome of a 50-50 exchange. That's not Randy Couture leaning on someone on the fence with a collar tie and hammering them with punches. That's you both there moving around semi-freely in just sort of like slightly anchored to each other. 50-50 exchanges, there's not really anything you can do. It doesn't matter how good you are. If you are both throwing and in range to be hit and you're not doing anything to stop them hitting you, you've got a good chance of getting hurt, It's a shame because he's very crisp out of range. So he falls to 4-2, and both of his losses have come from taking on good opponents. And a lot of people have said, like, good opponents too early, but he's clearly hanging with them. It's the overconfidence and the push for the finish unnecessarily. I can't remember all his fights off the top of my head, but I seem to remember they're all pretty quick finishes. He's not fought like he wants to. Round one. And none of them past 4 minutes. So, you're not fighting. The best way for someone with extreme talent to fight is to just keep trying to beat people in exchanges, just keep trying to win every engagement, and if the opponent falls down, that's great. Going out and trying to kill people and then chasing the kill constantly is a great way to, George Foreman always said, don't chase a puncher. You do what you do, and if he's hurt, go to the body, be clever. Don't run face first in expecting a finish, because guys like Badr Hari and all sorts of other guys have made careers out of, if they get hurt, they'll wait for you to come in and try and crack you as hard as they can when you open up. Well, not made careers, but saved important fights by doing that. But yeah, Eddie Bravo was saying Pico should use his wrestling more, but and then the fight happened, and it's pretty much what Aaron Pico said afterwards. He's like, yeah, I'll probably use my wrestling more. And then moving on to the main event, the sad one, the final of... Can we conclude that this tournament was shit? I think we have to thank Chael Sonnen for giving us the only interesting moments in this tournament. But the tournament, as we pointed out at the start, 8 dudes, 4 of them heavyweights, only 2 of the fighters in the tournament not completely washed up, and only 1 of them was a heavyweight, and he didn't win. And if you look at Ryan Bader's bracket compared to Fedor's, it's actually pretty incredible. Fedor got Frank Mir in the first round, who's completely washed. He was 2-7 when he met Fedor, and then 2-8 in his last 10 after Fedor fought him, and finished in like 3 in a row before that. Meanwhile, Bader got King Mo, who's still sort of regarded as a guy who can be dangerous, in the first round, and then Matt Mitrione, the other guy who's not washed up in the tournament, in the second round. And imagine having to hold down Matt Mitrione's gigantic ass, and then looking at the other side of the semi-final bracket, and Fedor's beating up an old middleweight who, every time he goes up to light heavyweight, he goes, oh, I'm too small, I'm going back down. So now he's fighting at heavyweight. The only exciting moments of this tournament were Fedor getting wins against really bad opposition, and people pretending Fedor was back, and Chael Sonnen beating Rampage Jackson, which wasn't particularly exciting, but was certainly funny. And the tournament was probably put together because Rampage didn't want to get back in shape to fight at light heavyweight, which is his actual weight class. And now a lot of these old guys are getting like guaranteed payouts, so they're not fighting for a win purse, so they could just show up and take a few punches or fight very conservatively and do whatever. Yeah, so the tournament was just garbage. And in the main event of this card was garbage, because, you know, good on Bader. Came out, I think it was the same left hook he caught King Mo with. Like, just feinted a lot, feinted the level change. Fedor's lead hand goes down, his right hand is always at his nips anyway. And then the left hook just caught him on the end of it. A very long left hook, that Michael Bisping style one, and turned him on the point of the chin, and then just smashed him with a right hand on the ground to follow up, and Fedor was done. And you can say it's the chin, you could say it's the quickness, the reactions, because he seemed to be moving a little bit slowly in reaction to Bader's feints anyway. Threat the takedown, obviously always a thing. I was very interested to see Fedor on the ground. I don't know if I said this last episode, but you know, Fedor's guard was always force your way back to closed guard or full guard or whatever you want to call it, dig an underhook on one of the legs and swing into an armbar. But firstly, armbars don't work very well if you're pressed against the cage. It was never really a concern for Fedor on his back against guys like Coleman and Hongman Choi. But if you watch someone like Yaya Rodriguez, who throws a lot of armbars up now, Frankie Edgar just pushed him to the fence, stacked his hips over his shoulders, and then started punching down. And, you know, if Yaya wanted to swing an armbar, he couldn't get his legs overhead. And if he wanted to, like, try and do an overhead sweep or some shit like that, or roll over his shoulders, he couldn't, because the fence was in the way. And if Edgar ever got off balance, he could just put his head against the fence. His own head, that is. Add to that, you know, Bader's whole thing has been like cradles and Turks. He's always holding one leg and advancing position until he's in a really good position. He's never really caught in full guard that much. So yeah, I was very interested to see how the ground games matched up, but we didn't really get a chance. So that's a shame. I think if you were watching this and you didn't know who Fedor was, I don't think there's too many people who don't know who Fedor is and were watching this or interested in this in any way. But Fedor's best days were like 2000. Well, his rings run was good, but he burst onto like the consciousness of mainstream MMA, as mainstream as it was back then. With the arrival in Pride, he wasn't very impressive in his first Pride fight. His first Pride fight was against Semi Schilt, who was 7 feet tall, so always a little bit tricky, and very good at timing knees. So quite concerning if your whole thing is to take him down. But he did decently against Semi Schilt and won the fight convincingly. But it was the Heath Herring fight that really sold everyone on Fedor, and that was November 2002. Actually, I thought that was 2003, but Herring and Nogueira had just fought like a couple of I think it was just the one so far, but a great fight for the heavyweight title. And I think the idea was to set up a rematch. They were giving Heath Herring and Fedor like a #1 contender fight to set up the title fight with Rodrigo Nogueira, and Fedor just mauled him. This guy had grappled or held his own with Rodrigo Nogueira, and he was just being manhandled by Fedor. And Fedor, it was like the most effective ground and pound people had seen. Igor Vovchanchin had been grounding and pounding people, and people were impressed by that. But it was sort of the most like dynamic ground and pound people had seen, and no one had seen it from Fedor before either. Because in rings, there's always a referee there going, "Body, no face, body." So Fedor always had to throw these hold himself back and throw these weird punches to the body while the opponent sort of crossed their arms over their body, like he did in Fight Night if the opponent was only attacking the body. So it was super weird to watch, but it was also like one of those moments you remember being like, wow, that's changed things a bit. It's like when you start seeing the Danaher or Gordon Ryan or someone like that competing in tournaments and beating everyone with the inside heel hook, and you're going, wow, that's going to change things a bit. So that was how I felt when I watched Fedor ground and pound the Heath Herring. And then he went against Nogueira, and people were expecting him to try and keep it standing and use his wrestling to keep it standing, and he just jumped into Nogueira's guard. And Nogueira constantly sitting up looking for Kimuras and things like that. Fedor was putting his hands on the mat, which is something you're not supposed to do in jiu-jitsu, because guys can hug the arm or go sit up for the Kimura or get an overhook and start working for things. And he'd wait for Nogueira to grab a hold of the arm and sit up for a Kimura. He'd like post on the back of Nogueira's tricep, rip his arm out, and punch Nogueira in the head while his arms were both down, trying to grab at Fedor's hand. And there was another one too where he got caught and he couldn't get his arm out, and he extended his arm a little bit, put his knee on the arm on the bottom arm of Nogueira, ripped his arm out again, and punched him in the face off that. It was so cool. And he was just doing lots of stuff like that. Like he was ripping his head out of triangles, which turned into a bad habit against Fabricio Verdum. But then he hadn't been really grappling like that much in fights up until then. And whenever you watched Fedor training, it was like working out on the playground, and then you'd go inside this building, put down some mats that were like curling up into the corner of the room because they didn't actually fit the room, and he'd have Roman Zentsov sit in his guard or something like that. And Roman Zentsov had a good left hook, but overall his contribution to MMA very small. Alex Emelianenko is a guy who's remembered as like what could have been, and just there weren't that many great MMA fighters in Fedor's camp. It was always like, what if this guy got to a great camp with great coaches? And there were fights that really didn't matter. Like anyone who was a champion in Pride ended up fighting a load of non-title fights and a load of fights against cans. That's just how it went. Gary Goodridge was, I think, 17 and 13 by the time he fought Fedor. Yuji Nagata was 0-0-0. Some guy was trying to tell me, like, oh, yeah, well, Nagata was a legit catch wrestler. You're like, no, he wasn't. Even Mark Coleman, by the time he fought Fedor the first time, everyone knew that he was past his best. Fedor's career was built off beating Nogueira and having, Nogueira beat everyone, and then Fedor beat him twice. Well, twice, because they fought 3 times, but the cut stopped the second one. And the second one was the one that Nogueira was actually doing pretty well in, so Fedor switched up his tactics in the third and just boxed him up on the feet for the most part. And the Krokop fight was obviously enormous too, but there were all these fights, like the rematch with TK didn't need to happen, Zuluzinho didn't need to happen, Mark Hunt, even though Mark Hunt did well, didn't need to happen, Yuji Nagata, Gary Goodridge, Kazuyuki Fujita surprised some people, but again, he was 9-3 at the time, didn't really need to happen. And then, these fights against guys like Matt Lindland, a middleweight, and he used the ropes to help him there. Hongman Choi, what the fuck's the point of that? So the Tim Sylvia, Andrei Arlovski pair is like the getting back into relevance in 2008 rather, for like the first time since he fought Krokop in 2005. Up until that point, it was like people were ranking him as number 1 in the world. Sherdog was, a lot of other websites were, but it was sort of getting hard to keep arguing that this guy, who wasn't really fighting anyone, was the best in the world. So the Sylvia and the Arlovski wins were huge for him. Brett Rogers was kind of a bad fight for him, and then he starts really falling off. Fabricio Verdum, Antonio Silva, Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson, when you're getting... He's so much small... Well, Fedor's a small heavyweight, but Dan Henderson is a middleweight. And he's not a particularly slick middleweight. He's got a big right hand, but if he's sort of like one of those watershed fighters. If you are smart and good, and you can fight smart, you should beat him. If you aren't smart but are very good, you will still probably lose to him. And then there was that like streak where he just went Jeff Monson, Satoshi Ishii, Pedro Hizo, didn't matter, retired, came back and fought Jaydeep Singh. Why? Fabio Maldonado looked terrible, and then we're getting into his Bellator run. So, we could do the whole greatest of all time thing. I don't really give a shit about that. But Fedor, unless you've watched him at his prime, and you still can, that's the wonderful thing about fighting in the modern era. In Hemingway's book, Dangerous Summer? No, what is it? Death in the Afternoon, the one about bullfighting. It's an interesting book because he writes a lot about writing in it, which is something that Hemingway didn't typically do. He thought it was very bad luck to talk about writing. And there's lots of interesting things in that book that aren't bullfighting, which is one of the reasons that I enjoyed it. But his argument for bullfighting was that, it is a tragedy. Each bullfight is a tragedy played out. And it only lasts momentarily. It's there for the people in the arena, and then it's gone forever. It only lives on in your mind. The wonderful thing about fighting in the modern era is that it's all put down, well, I was going to say on celluloid, but it's all put down on some form of media where we can revisit it. So you can watch Fedor versus Krokop and look at him and say, wow, that guy actually looked after himself very well against a very good kickboxer and used his head movement, banged the body, did clever stuff. You can watch him against Nogueira the second time and just see the level of this guy's takedowns, the beautiful transitions from striking into takedowns, his use of the jab and low kicks and things to beat up Nogueira at range before using the right hand to enter on attacks. And even later in his career, like, he'd have the occasional fight where he fought very smart, like Pedro Hizo, probably because he felt completely unthreatened, but he's like hooking off the jab and jabbing to the body and coming up with the hook and things like that. And then you watch fights like Antonio Silva, as soon as he feels threatened, it's just overhand, overhand, overhand. The fight IQ of Fedor, by the end of his career, was incredibly overrated. But, you know, up to that, the Cro Cop fight and the Nogueira fights, incredible fight IQ. Just by the end of his career, it was like he was in love with his hands, but he also didn't want to actually show his technique. He was just like, I'm going to throw my hands. And I think that's, you know, that can also be accounted for in like what guys do. If you're training for 20 years, well, more than that, because he's been training since he was a kid in Sambo. And if you trained Sambo since you were a child and now you're almost 40, you're going to get bored of training Sambo. You know, you're going to fall in love with other things you're doing, like boxing. And you're going to focus more on them. And so that's why I suspect that's why almost all the footage coming out of Fedor in training camps and things, by the time that the Tim Sylvia fight happened, was of him boxing. And, you know, Fedor was always regarded by people who knew Fedor as a good striker or a competent striker with big power, but didn't score a lot of knockouts very early on. The surprise was how hard he hit, in addition to being this amazing threat on the ground. Let's see. Hold on. I'm going to work out how many knockouts he scored. He knocked out Takada. I remember that was a jab right hand and shifted into a left uppercut along the ropes. And Takada just sort of like barrel rolls once he hits the floor. So that's in his third fight in 2000. In 2000. And then he scores a knockout over Chris Hazeman in rings in 2002. And then it's not until Gary Goodridge he gets another one. They're pretty split up. Like I think by the time he fought Sylvia, he's had something like 6 or 5 knockouts total or TKOs. Yeah, he was always a multifaceted threat, and it was how hard he hit and how well he hit on the ground opened up all those opportunities. Yet by the end, you know, by the time he's fighting Brett Rogers and he's just throwing the right hand over and over again, it was like, oh, Fedor, he hits really hard, and you're going, I thought he was a Sambo master. But I mean, what more is there to say? Like, he got very sloppy by the end. If you watch him against Mitrione, people are like, oh, well, it could have been Mitrione that got knocked out. And you're like, well, no, it was Fedor who got knocked out because he decided to drop his hands and trade a punch with a guy who had like 40 pounds on him or whatever. It wasn't even that much. But like, you know, if a young big guy, trades punches 1-for-1 with an older guy who's been beat up a lot, you know, you firstly, it's a 50-50 exchange, but you're also putting yourself at bad odds by doing that. Fedor at his best was about taking away everything the opponent was good at, or going to the area that they were good and giving them problems there by doing clever things. You know, he wasn't just standing in the middle of the ring against Cro Cop and throwing right hands. But anyway, you know, I wanted to have a ramble about Fedor because I remember all the good stuff he did, and I cut my teeth in this game writing like a series of 3 articles on him. And I think I've gone back to him dozens of times since. Anytime someone hits a nice right hand and comes up on the right underhook, or weaves into a double leg on that side, or goes into like a high body lock on the other side, I link Fedor doing it to Nogueira at some point, or Fedor doing it to someone else. And I go, well, yeah, that's what we like. We like the old punch and clutch. You know who was great at that? Fedor Emelianenko. Anytime someone throws the legs aside and comes in with the right hand or the left hand, I go, hey, you know who was great at that? Fedor Emelianenko, the old Fedor special. The guy pioneered, well, didn't pioneer, I suppose did pioneer a lot of stuff in MMA. I think the problem that I have with Fedor is he's fallen into that position where people just want to see him for the sake of Fedor, and they want to see him get a win. And you go, no, that's not how fighting works. You know, the older you get, the less likely you are to get the wins. He's just going to get hurt. And then when he does get a win, suddenly it's, oh, Fedor's back, why'd you doubt him, blah, blah, blah. He was actually shovel-hooking Frank Mir. You're just going, no, he's just fighting bad old men. And why do you want him to get to the final against someone very good? Yeah, so the entire tournament was shite, basically. And the welterweight tournament actually still looks really good. So I think it's an interesting comparison between this and the Strikeforce tournament. Because the Strikeforce tournament was where people thought Strikeforce was going to come into its own. They spent all this money to get these great heavyweights when the UFC still didn't own a lot of great heavyweights. The UFC took a long time after Pride to gather up the heavyweights. And because the Pride heavyweight division was probably better than the UFC one, but it's always been a fairly weak division. 7 good guys spread out over 2 organizations, and I think like 2 of them were in the UFC. So, not using actual numbers. Don't get in the comments and go, actually, I think you'll find Andrei Arlovski, Tim Sylvia, and Frank Mir were in the UFC. But the Strikeforce tournament was supposed to be like this coming of age thing, but they spent all this money on it, and then they sold up almost immediately afterwards. And it sort of fell apart in the running of it. Daniel Cormier wasn't in the tournament and then won the tournament. Overeem got called up to the UFC while he was in the tournament, having won the fight and not lost in the tournament. So it sort of fell apart. But this tournament was way worse, but might end up being better for Bellator because people actually tuned in for it. If you can make an argument that this tournament was better as a spectacle or as a tournament or a sport or whatever than the Strikeforce one, I mean, feel free to try. But just I think it's telling that Fedor was the old man of the Strikeforce tournament, and here he is again in the Bellator tournament. But yeah, I think this one probably worked out a lot cheaper. I feel like Scott Coker's learning as he goes along. You can't just spend all the money on great fighters. Well, you can if you're one, and there's just a bottomless pit of venture capital. But Scott Coker does seem to do a good job of balancing the books on these things, and they do very well at the gates in these cars that they take various places, and they're doing well on TV and so on. So I think it would be amazing to have an actual heavyweight tournament, but it would be also a massive overreach by Bellator to do it at this point. Also, there just aren't that many good heavyweights outside the UFC. Actually, in the run-up to this fight, some guy on Twitter was like, Fedor health issues, blah, 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 rumour before the fight. And I jokingly, because anytime people just believe a guy on Twitter, I'm like, stop doing that. You are the exact kind of idiot that's making the world worse. So I tweeted, heard like word for word, the Floyd Zab tweet, but with Fedor Emelianenko and Geronimo dos Santos. Geronimo dos Santos is a bum. Well, he's the gatekeeper of bumdom. If you can beat him, you're probably a top 20 heavyweight. And you can still be a top 20 heavyweight and a bum, by the way. That's how bad this weight class is. But if you can't beat him, you're pretty much a bum. So I deliberately used a terrible fighter as part of the joke. And then I immediately followed it up with a tweet attached to that tweet saying, this is a satire tweet. Please don't bet the house on Bader because of this. And still, I go to Reddit the next day. I've got people tagging me in this thread of the knockout, the clip of the knockout. And there's people everywhere going, oh, wow, I guess he must have actually been really hurt in the week up to the fight in that sparring with Geronimo dos Santos. And you're going, Jesus Christ. And then some idiot who's always like, you should be more responsible, Jack, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I've never broken a news story in my life. I'm very public about the fact that I don't break news. I'm not a reporter. And the second line was, this is a joke. So if you can't read past the first line of the thing you're reading, you deserve to be duped. But yeah, just amazing that people need a reason for Fedor, whose chin has been shot for a while and who hasn't been very good for almost 10 years at this point, to lose. Oh, actually, no, before we do that, let's do what's next for Bader. Someone was trying to, I've seen a lot of people actually being like, I think at this point, there's no argument against champion versus champion cross promotion fights. The UFC need to get involved with Bellator. No, the UFC doesn't. The UFC doesn't need any of that. Firstly, no one's picking Ryan Bader over John Jones or Daniel Cormier. I don't think I'd pick him over Gustafsson. If Anthony Johnson decided to roll out of bed and lose some weight, he could probably beat Bader again. But Mousasi versus Robert Whittaker or whatever, Mousasi went there because he doesn't want a challenge. Leave him be. And then Ryan Bader versus the other heavyweights in the UFC, God, that'd go badly. I want to see Ryan Bader versus Derek Lewis. That's the money fight. Anyway, I reckon we're over time. Let's reconvene later in the week and we'll talk about the upcoming fights on the weekend. If you want to sign up to the Patreon and get in on the Boxer episode, which is coming out on Friday, that's the Boxer Rebellion, not just generically boxers, or just support the podcast generally, but I do promise stories about giant clitoris, Sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send a question to the podcast, I promise I will answer some in the second one of this week. fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. If you want to see what I'm writing at any time, fightprimer.com. And Buy Notorious. I haven't done that one in a while. I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast, and I'll catch you later in the week. Oi tone vecha bless.